Welcome to the very first of our chats here in this part of the zone, and we are really excited to have Julian Gough as our guest, polymath, I would say, man of many talents, jack of all trades. And the idea is that we're going to explore the space between science and art, so not projects that do arts and science, the sort of, additive values, but actually go into that space between the two fields. So it's really nice to have Julian here. Good. Let me just give a 10-second introduction to Julian. He's a rock star, stand-up comedian, and a children's book author, at the same time a science fiction author, and is changing the world of physics right now with a very exciting project called The Egg and the Rock, which is the first thing that we're going to talk about. And we are the ZoNE, a project exploring the space between arts and science in Vienna, which contains our curator, Başak Şenova, who's not here today, artists Bronwyn Lace and Marcus Neustetter, and me, who I am I guess, a biologist and someone who's trying to be a natural philosopher centuries after natural philosophy has died out. So let's dive right in. So as we have experienced the last few years, and Julian, I know you're struggling with, doing this kind of project is not something we do for commercial reasons, not to get rich and famous. So the first question is, why do you as an artist engage in a topic about science?
Well, yeah, my background, I was in a band and I've written books in various genres, and I've always written, but the novel seemed to me, my last novel was near future science fiction, and as I was writing it and researching it, I was getting deeper and deeper into ideas that I found so interesting that they were essentially more interesting than the fiction. And I thought I needed to take the scientific ideas that I was playing with and exploring and just take them out of the novel and just show them as themselves, because I feel there's a huge amount of meaning hidden in scientific data, especially over the last 30 years, which has never been extracted, because I think that the artistic world and the scientific world have kind of split apart in a way that's really bad for both of them. Like most of the literary novelists I know in Ireland couldn't tell you what a proton is, and they wouldn't know the difference between a galaxy and an asteroid. And that's a real shame, I think, because we're getting fire hoses of data now from the James Webb Space Telescope and from all kinds of probes all around the near and far universe that are probing our local neighborhood and the sun and the galaxies and the going right back as far as they can towards the birth of this universe. And not many people in the artistic world are actually diving into that, and the scientific world isn't capable of extracting meaning from it. It's just the limitations of its model make it extraordinarily good at accumulating data, but completely incompetent at extracting the meaning from it. And that used to be the role of the arts. Like if you look at it, there was this wonderful feedback loop for a very long time between the novelist and the scientist. Mary Shelley, and I probably attended dissections of corpses where they were put, where galvanism was being demonstrated, where they were running electricity through bodies and making them twitch, and that inspired Frankenstein, and Frankenstein in turn inspired a whole way of thinking about life and biology and the difference between living and dead materials and androids, and there was a loop there. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, they were writing about traveling to the moon, traveling under the sea in submarines, and then people built the stuff. There was a kind of I think I'd call it kind of the Star Trek, communicator to Motorola cell phone pipeline, where kids would grow up reading about possible scientific futures and scientific breakthroughs, and then they would build the stuff that was in the science fiction stories. That was a really interesting loop, and it's kind of broken. So yeah, so I thought, and I found one or two really huge ideas that I think have not escaped the gravity well of science. They just haven't escaped into the wider world, and I think they need to, because they're transformative. They're more transformative than any novel I could write. So I ended up writing this nonfiction book, the Egg and the Rock, which I'm working on now in public. Yeah.
So this is another interesting point, because you're doing the book writing as a public performance in blog form, and this is something we're actually trying in our project as well. So I'm really interested in how you settled on that. Is that one part, I guess, is to put the pressure on yourself. If it's in public, you have to sort of produce more, to be seen producing.
Yeah.
But we talked in the past offline, and you told me this is a performative aspect of the way you do things. That's one part of the question. The other part of the question, though, is you're not doing art. You're writing this in a very interesting format. If you look at the blog, we'll post a link to that. You had this introduction where you have lots of quotes by scientists, and then you play off that. So you clearly distinguish your voice from that of the original scientists. And we're interested in something that we call Wissenskunst, which is the play with actual scientific ideas. So it is really not clear here, are you doing art or doing science? You're doing both, right?
Yeah. Well, I've started to call it jazz science, because in a lot of cases, what I'm doing is I'm taking the classics and I'm improvising off them, but they're rooted in the classics. That I don't, the chord structure is science, but where I end up might be somewhere more literary. So a couple of pieces I've written are based on papers that I think also deserve a wider audience, because that there's a More is Different, that paper by Anderson from the 1960s, is it?
1972.
So is it 72? Sorry, 72. Which was published in Science. It's a fantastic paper. It's been cited thousands of times, but I don't think science has actually fully taken on board its lessons. It's a wonderful paper about how more is different. If you go up the scales of matter, there's going to be these emergent properties that simply could not have been predicted from the lower scale. And you're starting again, is that you can do fundamental science at multiple levels. And it's very powerfully argued. It's very short. It's very juicy. And I think the level at which it has most notably not been applied is the universe itself. I think the scientific approach to the universe is fundamentally flawed to understanding it in a way that means it can't understand what it's looking at. And I think people like Anderson were talking about this in the 70s, and yet there's a fundamental problem with reductionist material science that means it can't. It's had a long time to solve this problem, and it hasn't solved this problem. So I think some of the solutions are going to have to come from the outside. They're going to have to come from outsiders, and that's why I'm doing this work. Yeah.
All right. For me, that's a really interesting point. So the framing, breaking the frame, and sort of looking at it from an outside perspective is something that not only happens in physics right now. We have a discussion about AI, and the people who are into the techniques and the algorithms, they are using a strategy very much saying that anybody who doesn't understand exactly how the algorithm works doesn't have anything to say about it, which is, I think, very pernicious and very bad. So you're breaking through this by bringing. So what is the perspective that you can bring in? Is it important that you are an artist, or do you just put a scientific hat on because you read a lot about the science and you're being a scientist now? How do you see that?
Well, I think I'm being the kind of scientist that used to be fairly common and is now almost extinct. I'm I mean, if you read Newton's notebooks, he's 30% physicist, mathematician. He's 30% alchemist. He's 30% religious lunatic. You know, he's a complicated guy, and he doesn't see a hierarchy here. He sees all of them as being useful and interesting. And you know, I don't think he would have been as good a mathematical physicist, you know, making breakthroughs in those areas if he hadn't also studied alchemy and religion and just had a very like restless open mind, you know. You know, he wasn't a professional scientist. He wasn't peer reviewed. He wasn't, you know, he didn't go through the modern kind of PhD program, and he wasn't the product of that kind of world. And that gave him, I think, an ability to completely rethink how the whole thing works. Einstein, well, you know, Einstein was very much an outsider in that community. He found it very hard to get a job. He ends up working in the patent office. He gets his breakthroughs in the patent office. If he'd been offered a professorship, if you know, that if the Germanic world hadn't been so anti-Semitic at the time, and he got the job that he clearly deserved based on his qualities, would he have made the same breakthroughs, or would he have been socialized out of thinking that wildly, that, you know, that freely? I don't know.
So you're talking about the natural philosopher, basically. Yeah, so to clarify, you're not saying we all have to become religious lunatics to have a different framing, but you're saying
not. Religious lunatics in general do not make good scientists.
We have to contextualize. So what I hear out of your words, and I hope I don't put words in your mouth, is that it's about contextualization of science. When you say scientists cannot make meaning out of their own results, they would possibly be offended by that, but you're saying it happens within a specific framing, and we have to take science out of that framing and into a context again. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there's been I'm saying of several things, so it's a big complicated issue. There isn't a simple, I can't give you a simple one-liner that kind of explains science. It's clearly an incredibly complicated thing we're talking about here, but I think that there has been a series of things have happened to science that have had an overall negative consequence for its ability to make breakthroughs and to extract meaning from its data. One is increasing specialization. I mean, a lot of people have written about this. A lot of people have studied this, but you've got each individual scientist is now studying a narrower and narrower subset of the entire scientific realm. And they have to, because it's, you know, human beings have cognitive limits. There's only a certain amount they can study and learn, but the amount of material that is being produced by science is so enormous that just by standing still, scientists know less and less about the amount of stuff that science as a whole is producing. So they're becoming hyper specialized. You know, the number, is it something like every 9 years the number of scientific papers published doubles? So, you know, this isn't science's fault. This is, in fact, an unavoidable consequence of the success of science. You know, but inside that specialization, the languages are getting more specialized inside, because they have to. Again, because they have to. No one's doing anything bad here. No one's doing anything wrong. But the consequence is that even if you wanted to have a broader take on science and draw from multiple realms of science, multiple fields, you've got to learn a whole bunch of different languages in order to even read the papers. So communication between fields is breaking down because people are more specialized, because the languages are increasingly specialized. It's a Tower of Babel problem as well. You know, Newton probably read every scientific paper ever published. You know, there were no journals. When he was in his, he was in his 30s or something when the first journal was set up. There were no back issues to read. You know, it was the Journal of the Royal Society or whatever. You know, a year or two later, the French set up one. There's two journals. Neither of them have back issues. You can really be on top of science if you're Newton. You know, but it's unbelievably difficult to even have a grasp of your own field or subfield in any given area of science now. And that means that we apply the word scientist to Newton, and we apply the word scientist to a new PhD graduate coming out of Stanford or, you know, whatever. but they're not the same person. They're not doing the same job. They're not living inside the same culture. They're under completely different sociological pressures. The continuity of the word is very misleading. Continuity of the word science is very misleading. What we have now is nothing like science 100 years ago. 100 years ago, America was producing, I can't remember how many PhDs in physics every year, but it was like a dozen, maybe, something like that. And now it's producing thousands. So you've got and you've got a huge problem of synthesis. You're producing more and more material in more and more fields. And we know from the history of science that the way you make breakthroughs is you connect material across fields. That's always where the breakthroughs come from, the big ones. You take ideas from one field, you apply them to another field, and you realize, oh my God, this is a breakthrough. So synthesis is where the big breakthroughs are going to come from, but we don't have synthesizers. We don't have people. We're producing huge numbers of specialists and hardly anyone to synthesize it. And the structural problems in funding, the structural problems in how departments are set up mean that there's massive pressure to specialize on everybody, and almost no reward is given for synthesizing. And synthesizing takes a long time. You have to learn a bunch of languages. You have to, read across fields. So in a way, I'm coming in as a synthesizer because I've had this weird life where I've been allowed to pursue my obsessions, read anything I was interested in for decades. Because that was what I did. Every time I'd be writing a book, I'd research, I'd read a lot of stuff, and I was reading my own. I was just chasing my obsessions for the last few decades. And what you end up with is an incredible overview. It's not deep in any given field, but it's broad, very, very broad. And I think I found patterns that are profound, that really, really matter, and that any given individual scientist is going to have huge problems in even perceiving. So
thanks. There's so much to pick up on. So first, the history of science. The term scientist was only coined in the late 19th century, actually.
There were natural philosophers before that, weren't they?
Yes. And so it's a recent thing, but as you pointed out, I mean, even the last 20 years of science that I've actually witnessed, it's been completely transformed by a set of incentives that values the production over the quantity of production over integration. Definitely doesn't pay off because it's all about producing novel results. And so you can make an argument. Biologist E.O. Wilson said, we're drowning in data, but we're starving for wisdom. And that's sort of the problem we end up with. There's another really interesting effect, which is you were mentioning this sort of change in science. This can actually be measured empirically. There's a new field called science of science, which has shown that most real breakthroughs come through the crossing of boundaries, crossing of fields. So this is very important for radically interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary projects like ours.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that if you have too much publication in a specific field that people cannot read anymore, you get a regression to the mean. So the people who are really innovating are no longer seen because there's a canonical gospel that starts setting in. There's a recent paper. We'll link to it in the show notes. So this is a real problem. Yeah. So this is empirical evidence. What you're saying is actually happening right now in this transforming science. So what we're creating here is a niche for, if I understand you properly, for a new kind of profession, the kind of person who still has the freedom to play. So I've been doing
play is a key thing, I mean,
right.
It's, when Richard Feynman made his kind of breakthroughs and came up with the Feynman diagrams and did all the kind of work he did in quantum electrodynamics, it came out of playing with plates. He was trying to work out why plates spin, why spinning plates are stable on sticks if you have spinning plates on a stick. But what's happening there? What's the and it was completely playful. It wasn't aimed at anything, but it's where the breakthroughs came from. So I agree with you. And also, I think you said in a piece you wrote recently on your own website that how practically everyone who gets a Nobel Prize in the last 50 years in their speech says, I couldn't have a career if I started now. I couldn't do this research that just won me the Nobel Prize if I started now. It's a refrain in every Nobel Prize speech in the hard sciences.
So the most recent famous one was Peter Higgs of Higgs boson fame,
right.
who said that there was no way that he would have succeeded.
And that's a really important piece of information that is repeatedly being delivered, and yet it seems very hard for the super tanker of science to do any course adjustments. There's huge numbers of people around the edges trying to do something about it, but the mainstream scientific enterprise is it's finding it very hard to change course.
So we're coming to this point where you're saying, okay, within the system, if you're within the system, you're dependent on this crazy cycle of funding and this publish and perish culture, not
Yeah.
publish or perish anymore. And we need to either create those niches within the academic system, research system, but that's really hard. So we can take our artistic freedom, basically, to provide that service nowadays.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask on the other side. So you're an artist. So do you see what does it give you as an artist? So this is one side of the coin. So the flip side is how does your engagement with science influence how you do art?
Science influence how I do art. Well, let me take it almost the other way around. Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote Go der Lescher Bach and I'm a Strange Loop, and has done a lot of work on language and cognition. And he wrote another wonderful paper that I riff off in another classic that I play a little jazz based on, called Analogy as the Core of Cognition. And his argument in that paper or speech he gave is that we can't think without analogies. We just, we can't. All thinking really is jumping from one analogy to another, and often they're quite buried in the language. It's hard to see that they are in fact analogies because we're so used to them. We think this is just the way things are, but that's what we're doing. And he makes a strong argument for it. It's a great paper, well worth reading, extremely readable. And I think he's right. And I think that's a big part of the crisis in science is the linguistic territory that they are allowed to explore, especially in the hard sciences, is so narrow now. It's very mathematical and it's very abstract. And if you read papers in cosmology or astrophysics or astronomy, as I do, they're all in exactly the same linguistic register. They've all got, not entirely all, that you get a very small number of interesting people who are able to squeeze something through that's got something else going on. But essentially, they're not allowed to make the analogies that you would need to make to actually break through conceptually. They've trained themselves out of complex, rich language, analogy-rich language. That's seen as somehow not scientific. But you literally can't make breakthroughs without new analogies that come from elsewhere in the linguistic field. That you can see the territory that they're operating in linguistically narrowing, and it makes it, they literally can't think new thoughts. They can't think new thoughts because they can't use language to its full, where the new thoughts are implicit in the set of analogies that would be open to them, if you see what I mean.
So yeah, this is going back, again, there's research on this. It's about reframing problems. Right. And ultimately, this is called the problem of relevance, because you have to, as a human being living in a world that has lots of ill-defined problems, you need first to settle down. How do you frame a problem? And once you've settled down, you work within a certain frame. And that is, of course, a strong limitation. From there on, you leverage the constraints that you set yourself very productively to do something. And that's what a productive scientific discipline is about. But there are points, you can't have a permanent revolution, right? But you have to have the possibility. What you're saying is, what we're seeing is it's less and less possible to break out of those frames and reframe things, because that's not seen as a productive part of doing science anymore. It's seen as, so I can tell you that often people in empirical science, in my field, in biology, think that when you use the word philosophical, for them it means unanswerable questions that are not worth pursuing, right? So if it's not empirically testable right now, It's not there. And I would like to put this to you. It's about contextualization, right? I mean, you have a much richer context. You're now talking at a meta level of how these questions are framed in terms of language, and how important that is, because the empirical effect of that is the actual real world effect is that we ask different kind of questions if we can reframe the problem.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and because I'm a word guy, like my career looks slightly all over the place, but there's actually a fairly consistent line through it. If you're me, I can see it, which is, I use words. I wrote the words in my band. I wrote the words in my novels. I wrote the words at the ending to Minecraft. I've written. It's always words, and I use the words to try to see reality more clearly. That's the job I've been doing in my children's books, in my novels, in my in all my work. I want to see reality more clearly, and I think language can help us do that, because that's how we think. We think in language, and that's where that has taken me over time. Is I've been interested in bigger and bigger things, or more and more complex things, richer things. And the ultimate thing is the universe. And I think the way the scientific community talk about the universe is catastrophically linguistically limited. It's just unbelievably limited. And you can't understand it inside the territory they've allowed themselves linguistically. But the problem, there's many problems, but one of the problems is the language that you end up having to use if you do want to describe the universe more accurately. It overlaps with language that is genuinely unscientific. It overlaps with, you end up using terms that sound religious, or that sound purely metaphysical, or that sound, and that sets off the alarm bells in scientists. So you just can't use them. If you try and use them in a paper, people will go, whoa, is he sneaking in God here? Is he sneaking in some sort of metaphysical bullshit here? What's her secret real, it's looked at with grave suspicion using language from other realms. But the trouble is, a lot of the language used to think about and talk about the universe has come out of religious traditions, because before we had science, one of the realms where you would try to understand the universe was religion. It comes out of philosophical traditions, because the atom comes from Democritus. So, but you've got these traditions that where they did try to come up with ways of thinking about the universe, but they're saturated in all this stuff that makes scientists freak the fuck out. They don't want to hear it. So do you see what I mean?
I very much. In the sociology of science, this is called boundary work, which is the interplay of actual institutions that are set up in the real world, and they don't discover these boundaries in nature, but we're building the boundaries to demarcate a productive research tradition, and also, but then immediately demarcate what is valid discourse. And you're saying very accurately that the things that, so I think there we have to explicitly point to the philosophy of logical positivism that declared all metaphysics nonsense. And so it has been overcome in the philosophy of science over the last 100 years, but it's still very much stuck in many people's minds that are active researchers, and also the public thinking about the role of science. It's this idea that, stick to the facts. So I had a conversation with many friends, especially reductionist molecular biologists, who said, I don't need philosophy, I have the facts. And I said, well, that's a philosophy. It's called positivism. And, that is a philosophical statement. Or famously from Neil deGrasse Tyson up to Stephen Hawking saying, philosophy is dead. That is the best thing to say, because that is the ultimate philosophical statement. So you just basically disproven yourself, right? So that captures us, and it's this, since Leibniz, we've been trying to come up with a language that is unambiguous and clear about everything. And this goes in parallel with a broader idea of formalizing the whole universe. But the thing is that the universe cannot be formalized. So
of course. Yeah.
What do you think about the role of art in that's something that's very specific right now in our project. How can art speak about the things whereof you shall not speak? I'm here in Vienna, so that's Wittgenstein. We want to break that law, the Wittgenstein law, and speak of the things we cannot speak of. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of Wittgenstein. I like him. He has there's a, you know, there is a real problem in that we think in words, and words can't capture reality. They're a very lossy system. They're very reductive. You know, and there are, every language, there are traps inside language that you're not aware of. You know, I mean, you know, the Aristotelian, you know, is a big problem. You know, it is that. Well, it isn't. It never is. And you know, and we constantly trip over that. I mean, you see that. I mean, people have been criticizing that for a long time. There was the attempt by that wonderful Polish guy to rewrite language without the is of identity. You know, and I think that's, you know, E prime, English prime, with that, where you don't use the is of identity. It's very interesting to try to do that for a while. You know, to try to actually write without saying science is broken, or, you know, God is dead, or, you know, just don't use the is of identity. I am Irish, you know, like, don't use that, and it, because these traps of language are really, really hard, and trying to understand reality through language is a doomed project. But you can get a lot closer than we're currently getting. You can get so much closer and still have the little, you know, asterisk footnote saying this is the map, it's not the territory. But we can have much better maps. Yeah.
So that's map and territory is often confused nowadays. So we start to live inside, not just, so models in a very broad sense, models of the universe, not just as in a mathematical model, but any sort of internal picture of the world that we have. So this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to get a little bit, switch gears and zoom in on what you're actually doing in the egg and the rock. Okay. I'm really interested in the specific work you've been doing there. But before we do that, I want to ask Bronwyn and Marcus if you want to interject something at this point, since I've been asking the questions so far. You guys okay?
I'm quite happily just sucking it all in.
Great. So, Julian, you've made, so to tell us first a little bit, maybe in a few sentences, what the egg and the rock, both the blog and the emerging book from that blog, are about, and then maybe tell us a little bit about the scientific content of you're actually doing science in there, I would say.
Yeah, I've made predictions.
how cheeky, how dare you?
Yeah. Okay, the egg and the rock's very specific. It's an attempt to kind of redescribe the universe. It's an attempt to go through all the data we've gathered over the last few decades and extract some meaning from it. And I actually have, okay, there's probably 3 layers to what I'm arguing in the egg and the rock, right? And it could fail on 1 or 2 of them, and I'm not that worried. But this is what I'm arguing, right? That you have to explain how the universe has gone from, you know, a very small, extremely hot, dense cloud of gas, which is almost completely undifferentiated. We know from the cosmic microwave background radiation that it was very smooth, it was very featureless. Tiny fluctuations, but almost none. This featureless gas. To you and me talking to each other in abstract language through technological devices inside a biosphere of astounding complexity, where life forms have continuously metabolically existed in an unbroken line, you know, child to parent for several billion years, while every single atom and molecule of that continues to obey the second law of thermodynamics. That has to be explained. But for science, one of the things that I get, one of the things that interests me is how scientists can look through a telescope at the universe, and they're only interested in explaining what is on that end of the telescope. And there's no attempt to explain what's on this end of the telescope, which is an astronomer who can conceptualize the universe, who can build technology that's able to look billions of years back in time inside a biosphere of insane complexity. And, you know, to talk about stars and galaxies as just balls of gas and inside mathematical language, and not wonder how it ends up like this against the gradient, against the headwinds of entropy, seems to me just bananas. You know, we don't, it's just bananas that they're not constantly asking that question and really, really engaged with it. Because it's beyond improbable that randomly interacting molecules with random attributes of blindly obeying arbitrary physical laws in a one-shot universe that is not particularly old, 13 billion years is not particular, generates this by mistake. But they can't ask that question because that question has been completely polluted by religion.
So just to clarify, you're talking about the fine-tuning question, why the parameters of the universe are exactly like they are, and you're saying there's a religious argument that says, oh, this must be God because it's not explainable from within the universe, or it's just a chance event, basically, that the parameters are tuned to these.
We've got this false binary. Yeah, we've ended up with this completely false binary, which is hot gas mysteriously bumps into each other and turns into you and me and the technology and the biosphere by chance, versus, which is bloody ridiculous, versus God did it, which is also bloody ridiculous. Because you can't just explain complexity by saying something even more complex did it that I can't explain, but you know, that doesn't fucking solve the problem. So you've got this ridiculous false binary of two stupid ideas rejecting each other endlessly. And there's a way out. And not only is there a way out, there's a way out that has been that there's even a theory to explain the way out, and it hasn't been explored. So I'm exploring it in the book. So what I really want to explain is why does the development of the universe, we've got an N of one here. We've got one universe. Let's look at it. This is how it progresses. Why does that progression look like the development of an organism? Why does it look like the development of an evolved organism over time, rather than the random interaction of arbitrary molecules declining in complexity as they should, given the second law of thermodynamics? Why does it look like an egg, not a rock? Why is it behaving like an egg, not a rock? That's a huge question. And
okay, so just quickly, I want to connect that back to what you said earlier. So a lot of scientists would say, because what you're saying here is mythical, spiritual, crazy talk, and because it's outside. I haven't
said anything yet. They will immediately jump to that. They will immediately assume I'm about to say a crazy mystical thing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, of course. And that's why this is complete. This whole debate has been completely sterile since Darwin. It's been sterile since, you know, Galileo. And so many interesting things have happened in that span of time. Anyway. The big argument is this universe develops like an organism into hyper complexity. You're a biologist. You know how complicated one cell is. And you know how complicated a multicellular organism is. It's just off the scale. But this is where we've ended up. Now, we know a mechanism that can give you complexity over time from simplicity, and it's evolution. Evolution can get you from slime to giraffes in about 25 trillion generations. Most of them are bacteria and they're lasting like 20, 30, 40 minutes. But nonetheless, iterate that many times and you can get giraffes. The universe is a giraffe, okay? Given that in the very local bit we can look at, there's a subset of the universe that is a giraffe, The universe is is a hyper-giraffe. It needs explaining. And how does a universe of this complexity come into being? The only mechanism we know of that can generate this kind of complexity is evolution. So I think that the starting point should be, did the universe evolve? Were there simpler universes previously? Because you don't have any other way of getting to this kind of complexity without evolution. DNA evolution definitely happens inside this universe. We know that. Technological evolution happens inside this universe. We know that. We go back 300 years, you couldn't communicate electronically. Go back 200 years, you had the telegraph, and you had a one-bit system with one key sending one bit of data down one line of wire. And now you've got the iPhone, and you and me are talking over Zoom. Right? That's evolution. That they evolved. Methods of communicating evolved technologically with human beings as the replicators, with each iteration improving and the feedback coming from people who wanted to use it or didn't want to use it, and then humans replicating it in factories. So you've got an evolutionary process there that's happening insanely fast, really, really fast, technological evolution. It's happening nested inside cultural evolution. Human beings generate cultures. They were hunter-gatherers for a long time. Then there's agriculture. Then there's a bit of mining iron going on, and at some point in there, and then eventually they work their way up the metals, and you end up with an industrial revolution and so on. And these are cultures evolving with, again, human beings as the replicators. Cultures often in competition, taking each other over, annihilating each other. It's, but there's an evolutionary thing happening there. So technology is evolving inside cultural evolution, which is evolving inside biological evolution at the DNA level, because it takes fairly complicated apes with fairly large brains to develop societies and to develop technologies. So we've got 3 layers of evolution now. Now we're back to DNA. That's definitely evolution, right? But DNA evolution is happening using chemicals, using elements that are complex and have attributes. Phosphorus has attributes. The bond strength of phosphorus is really, really nicely balanced, and that's why it's used for DNA unzipping and zipping. Carbon has attributes that make it ideal for long chain molecules, and so you get carbon right the way through complex life forms and so on and so on. But those attributes are complex attributes. Where do they come from? Well, why do you have the 90-something elements? Where do they come from? Well, so far it's always been evolution. Why wouldn't it still be evolution? But if it's evolution, if elements evolved, then they have to happen at the level of universes. Because this universe, the attributes of carbon haven't changed since the Big Bang. The attributes of phosphorus haven't changed since the Big Bang. But they could have changed in earlier universes that gave birth ultimately to this universe. That's where it would have to have happened. But those elements are formed from, bosons, mesons. They're formed from fundamental particles, which also have attributes, which allow carbon to be carbon, phosphorus to be phosphorus, and ultimately us to be us. So the fundamental particles that make up the suite of elements that make up the geosphere and biosphere and so on, where did they get their attributes? Evolution. Maybe. Let's keep going, because that's all we've ever, that's all that's made sense so far, and that has to happen at the level of universes as well. So is there any theory, is there any evidence that universes evolved? Because that solves a huge number of philosophical problems. It also solves a huge number of scientific problems. If the universe evolved, we solved the fine-tuning problem. There's a reason why all of our fundamental parameters for matter are so bloody odd. They're odd, the fine structure constant is a strange number. The mass of the electron versus the mass of the proton and the things that make up the proton, and why is neutron slightly heavier? These all have the kind of weird, slightly funky, slightly arbitrary feeling, but they fit together really nicely, feeling that any evolved entity has. the universe looks like a platypus. It makes sense, but it's got some very weird shit going on that can only really have evolved. Not that it can only have evolved, but evolution is the kind of thing that gives you something that looks as weird as the masses of the fundamental particles and the fine structure constant and so on and so on, and the speed of light. And if you fuck around,
something that looks contingent but is not in the end. Like that.
It looks contingent, but it is not. It looks arbitrary, but when you look at all the other things that look arbitrary, they fit together really nicely to do something very efficient. That is a classic sign of evolution in action. And the universe displays this really, really clearly. That there are very specific things. You want to let's do a deep dive into a specific thing. Let's just talk about. Let's go 20 minutes into the birth of our universe. 20 minutes in, you've got the deuterium bottleneck. You've got this weird thing that happens, where matter fuses, right? If you crush it together, it's hot enough, it's close enough, it fuses. Two hydrogens become a helium, a couple of heliums, off you go. So why doesn't all the matter fuse just after the Big Bang? It's really, really hot. It's really close together. Why doesn't it fuse? How do we end up with a hydrogen universe that can then build out stars, galaxies, planets, biospheres? The stars build out the suite of elements through nucleosynthesis. They distribute them through supernova explosions and relativistic jets in galaxies as well. But anyway, they distribute them, and then you can get planets, and then you get the buildup of chemistry on planets, because we start with about 12, maybe 16 minerals in the cloud of gas and dust that form a planet. And on Earth, we're up to 5,000 or 6,000 minerals now. That mineral complexification happens well before life. And then life is enabled by the initial complexification of the geology. The geology has to get complicated enough to allow the biology to kick off. It looks like chemically, it looks like one continuous process. So that's all coming out of the fact that you've got a hydrogen universe. But why didn't it all fuse into a whole bunch of heavier elements right at the start? Because there's a deuterium bottleneck, because there isn't a stable, you can't get a stable nucleus for two heliums fusing, whatever. Or you don't get a sort of atomic weight for kind of the specific nucleus that would cause a cascading fusion thing isn't possible, and then you have to deal with that.
So like the first step, right? It's unstable. So you fall back instead of going boom out into the more higher order elements.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. Yeah, yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's there's a couple of very specific things that just can't be done by nucleons, that if they were possible would mean we couldn't get this universe, we couldn't get this complexity. It would all just fuse up right from the start. You have a big mushy block of all kinds of elements, but that wouldn't be a universe. So it doesn't happen. But that's exactly the kind of thing you get in an evolved organism. It's like why do human primates have why do the females in humans have such broad hips? They're not great for running, but they're necessary because the babies' heads are really big in humans because they've got large brains. So you end up with these kind of fudges that in themselves are kind of weird, but you step back and look at the organism, you go, oh, there's a reason for that. It's part of the, evolution made that happen because it needs to make this happen, And the deuterium bottleneck is a really nice example of that. It's baked into the fundamentals of matter in this universe, that you won't be able to build exactly the nucleus that, if you could build it, would fuse everything right at the start. There's no explanation for that inside mainstream science. Google it sometime. It's like deuterium bottleneck. Why is there a deuterium bottleneck?
Well, it's one of the explanation. It's just because of the constants, and the constants are just because they are the way they are. So it's
why are they why are they the way they are? They are.
Yeah.
It's a direct consequence of them being very precisely the way they are, that you end up with a deuterium bottleneck, which is necessary to end up with a complex universe.
So that's one of the consequences. So the constants are fine-tuned, the fundamental constants, not just for simply to evolve life, but it goes through a whole cascade of different things that seem like just amazingly improbable events or coincidences that you normally wouldn't accept as a scientific explanation if something is that improbable, right?
Yes, and also this is an interesting thing. When science is predicting what it's going to see next as it explores the universe and as it explores the early universe and so on, all its errors lean in the same direction, which is revealing. Like they always find more structure, they find it earlier, it's always more complex, and it's always more efficient than they expected. This keeps happening. They find efficiencies they weren't expecting, they find structure they weren't expecting, and they find it earlier than they were expecting. Because, and my argument in the book is, it's because you're looking at the development of an evolved organism. That's an analogy. It's an analogy. The universe is the universe. It's not an organism. But I do think it is the best explanation for how it behaves is to treat it as analogous to an evolved organism undergoing a process of development that is essentially coded for by the evolved parameters of matter, the basic parameters of matter. That's
as opposed to the idea of the universe as a machine that's been pre-programmed for some reason that we don't know to behave the way it does.
Yeah, it's not pre-programmed. It's got here through a classic evolutionary process. And there's a theory that gives you a mechanism for this. So I might as well talk about now, which is cosmological natural selection.
Yes, before we get into that, so because you said so beautifully that we have always this bias in one direction, and you mentioned way earlier in the discussion that one of the things that triggered your online blog is the James Webb telescope. Could you just quickly, before you go into that direction, talk a little bit about you have a crazy project about the James Webb telescope, right?
Well, I've made some predictions. I probably need to talk about cosmological natural selection in order to talk about the predictions, because the predictions come out of that.
Okay, so that's fine. I just wanted to bring that on the table. So go on.
I'll go straight into that after this. Yeah. So if you've got an evolved universe, how does it evolve? How does it reproduce? Why does it want this complexity? Not want, but why do you how is this complexity evolutionarily valuable? How does that work? So there's a theory that a physicist called Lee Smolin came up with about 25-30 years ago, called cosmological natural selection, and it gives you it's based on ideas from John Wheeler, the great physicist John Wheeler, and Bryce DeWitt. He was a student of DeWitt, and the idea is that big bangs. Our universe was born in a big bang, and an expansion from a kind of a singularity. The big bangs are in fact the other side of black holes. Black holes are where matter and energy collapse into a singularity and basically disappear from this universe. The Big Bang is a singularity that comes out of we don't know where and expands. And John Wheeler was maybe the first guy to think about maybe they're the same thing looked at from different sides.
Is that also where the idea of wormholes come from, that you can go through a black hole on one end and then end up with the other?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of overlap there, but if I start going down wormholes, it's going to get really more complicated than it needs to. And
sorry,
there's so much material
distraction. Let's leave it.
But yeah, there's a bit of overlap there, but it'll get complicated. I don't want to get it too complicated. So if Wheeler had the idea that maybe energy and matter go into a black hole and vanish from a universe, come out in a new space-time, create a new bubble of space-time somewhere else, orthogonal to the original universe, outside of the space-time of that universe, create a new space-time. And he thought, well, if the fundamental parameters of matter were randomly different, you'd have a completely different kind of universe. So he has a primitive metaverse theory that there's multiple universes give birth to new universes through black holes, and they're randomly different. And maybe because they're randomly different, you get a really crazily complicated one by mistake eventually. Okay, it's a bad theory because, I mean, it's not a bad theory. It's nice, but it's very naive, and it doesn't really solve the problem of a universe this complex coming out of something that simple. It says, well, if there's enough of them, maybe one of them will accidentally become like this. Yeah, whatever. It's a naive multiverse theory, but it's okay. Smolin's breakthrough, which is completely underappreciated. I've talked to a bunch of physicists and astronomers and biologists about this now in the last year or two, and I've come to understand it's completely sociological. It's just sociological. The reason this was not engaged with is nothing to do with science. It's to do with the fact that a physicist published a paper in a really obscure journal, and not obscure in its field, it's big, but it's like the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity. Have you read the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity lately? No, nobody has. So he might as well have shot himself in the head as published this incredibly interesting, fruitful paper in the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity. But that's how science works. He didn't have. He wrote a paper that essentially should have generated an entirely new field, an entirely new way of thinking about how you approach studying the universe, and there was nowhere to publish it. There was nowhere.
Exactly. So probably he sent it somewhere else, and the sociological problem is that the gatekeeping nature of current peer review is keeping new ideas out increasingly in science.
Yeah. And when I talk to scientists about this, it's absolutely fascinating. They haven't engaged with it, they haven't read it, and they make naive criticisms that are completely wrong, like embarrassingly stupid and wrong.
So they're criticizing the paper that they haven't read.
About a paper that they haven't read.
Yeah.
And it's like,
okay, great. Yeah, that's solid.
Okay. Anyway, but the paper, and then he wrote a book about it, published through Oxford University Press, which is called The Life of the Cosmos, which unfortunately is kind of very difficult to read. He's not a natural writer, and he's done so much setup in the book that the interesting stuff is like 150 pages in. It begins to be the theory, and because he's doing so much setup and background and throat clearing and trying to tell you what the normal view of things is before he gets to the interesting stuff. It's like unbelievably badly structured,
kind of like reading The Lord of the Rings.
I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to, Yogi, do not divert me. I'm not going there. Okay, but it's so the book exists, but again, how many people have read it? And also the people that should read it are biologists, and it's a fucking physics book. It's a theoretical physicist's book. It's got evolutionary ideas in there because he read. He read a lot of evolutionary theory stuff and realized, oh my gosh, there's a mechanism here for the universe. But the book he wrote, it doesn't have an audience. That it's not, So for sociological reasons,
I can confirm that I read it, and it's really hard read. He does have a biologist friend, Stuart Kauffman, who tried to promote it among biologists with the kind of success that you described in physics before. People. Yeah. Didn't read it, didn't take it serious, and it didn't have an impact.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly. It's even you could just hit them over the head with the book, and they're not gonna read it. They're not gonna get to the end of it. They're gonna pretend they did, because you're their friend or whatever, but they're not actually gonna read it. So the ideas can't escape the gravity well of this very specific, very abstract, very mathematical language. It's a fucking language problem. But the idea is that if black holes give birth to big bangs, if parent universes give birth to child universes, and if the basic parameters of matter in the child universe are only slightly different to the parent universe, if they change slightly by the transition, then you're going to get evolution. Because the child universe will either be, because of the changes, the slight changes, will either be more or less likely to produce black holes. They'll be more or less reproductively successful. And the ones that are more reproductively successful, producing more black holes, will then have offspring that have a slight variation, and some of those will be more successful, some will be less successful. And you get a very simple evolution. You've got heredity and you've got evolution. It's very clean. It's very simple. It's not like how evolution plays out on Earth in the DNA organisms, because there you've got a constrained environment with competition and so forth and so on. What you've got here is each universe is both organism and environment. It's not in competition with anyone else. All it has to do is be reproductively successful. And so you should get, after a long period of universes giving birth to other universes, you should get universes that are, you don't like it when I say optimized, but let's say basically optimized for black hole production.
Well, adapted, right? I mean, adapted to black,
adapted, great, adapted to black.
So it's a little bit different than natural selection, because what you have is, it totally fulfills the minimum requirements for evolution, because all you need is a difference in heritable fitness, and that's what's happening. You have differential reproduction rates, and that's it. That's what you need. It's not exactly like biological reproduction, so it's maybe not adapted. It is maybe, you're right, optimized towards the production of more universes.
More universes, yeah. And our universe produces an enormous number of black holes. It produces a huge number of black holes. And as it goes on, we're only 13 billion years in, it will produce more and more black holes. At the moment, I can't remember how many trillion black holes there are, but the last study they did a year or two ago was like, it's in the trillions. We produce an enormous number of black holes, and we're going to produce more. The ultimate fate of this universe is basically it's all black holes. So that's kind of a sign that this universe is really good at producing black holes, and that's Lee Smollen's theory. And it never took off because I think no one engaged with it. Nobody, when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, everybody could read his book. Hardly any books on this, accessible books on scientific subjects were being published. Everybody read it, everybody understood it, and the idea gained traction.
Beautiful language. I mean, he describes it. I mean, the first chapter about pigeons is a little boring, but once you get over it, it's really an easy.
But the language is beautiful, and the whole, I mean, people still quote the last paragraph about the entangled bank and the richness of the ecosystem that you end up with. And I think Lee Smollen wrote a book that is as important, or certainly is the greatest extension of Darwin since Darwin. And it was completely missed. And it has incredible, it's got predictive power, it's got explanatory power. And the people don't realize that they've got a whole new territory to explore, and nobody's fucking exploring it. So I'm exploring it.
So this is beautiful. So it's opening new doors. I'm going to play. This is the first time that I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. So
please do. No, because the mainstream community are going to do it. So you might as well do it now. Yeah.
So I
love getting
going to come immediately at you, and you can answer it. I know that because I've talked to you in the past. This is not provable. It's pure speculation. I mean, you can argue that a lot of physical theory, like string theory, is of this kind nowadays, and it is taken serious. So there's a bias already in terms of saying, okay, this is not worth taking up because it's pure speculation, but that doesn't make sense. The other thing is, so are there ways in which you could actually gain empirical evidence for such a theory?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I've heard, of course I hear that critique, and it's wrong. Okay. So what you've got here is a situation where if the universe has evolved, if our universe is descended from much less complex universes, that's going to be the argument, right? We've got an N of 1. We've got one universe we can observe. We can't get out of it and look at others. We can't look at our child universes that are being created by our black holes, and we can't go back beyond the Big Bang to our parent universe. And that's fine, right? But an N of 1, if it's an evolved organism, contains a huge amount of information about its evolutionary history. And once you start looking at the universe through that lens, through that metaphor, through that analogy, through that, you, I think, can find evidence for evolution, and you can make predictions about this universe based on this theory. So I'll go into my predictions for the James Webb, right? So when the James Webb was, I've been thinking about this for years and years and years, and I didn't know where to begin. It's too big, you know. But then I realized that the James Webb Space Telescope, which is the marvelous new cathedral of science that they launched into space there last year, was going to come up with the very first data from the first billion years of our universe, because we've never been able to see that light. It's been because of the way space-time has been expanding since the Big Bang. It's stretched the light along with the space-time, so that the light that's coming from the first billion years has been stretched out and dropped into the infrared. You can't see it. You literally can't see it. If you pointed the Hubble Space Telescope at the earliest universe and left its lenses open for the rest of your life, it couldn't pick up that light. So there's been no way to see it, and you certainly can't see it from Earth, because absolutely everything on Earth is warmer than the heat you're looking for, because it's infrared light. So it's essentially dropped down from optical light into heat energy. Everything is warmer than it. Your telescopes are too hot. The air is too hot. Everything's too hot to see this light. So the James Webb's an astounding achievement. And when I'm being mean about reductionist material science, it's because I want that plus more. I don't want to denigrate reductionist materialism. The James Webb Space Telescope is an astonishing achievement, absolutely astonishing. So when it was going to come online, I realized I have a deadline here, because it's going to see things that have never been seen before. And if I can predict what it sees better than the mainstream, I'll have something I can point to say this theory has practical application. It can actually make predictions. So I try to think about, what are you going to see in the early universe, the first billion years, if this theory is true? If this universe has evolved to be optimized for black hole production and complexification, what's it going to see? So what I predicted was extremely rapid, extremely early galaxy formation. And the mechanism for that was that supermassive black holes happen first, before stars. Supermassive black holes happen first, and then generate stars and galaxies by mechanisms that are fairly easy to describe, and I've described in my predictions. So let me take this all apart, because there's a lot of stuff here to describe in order to make sense of this. And we have relatively recently, in the last few decades, we've discovered that pretty much every galaxy we look at seems to have a supermassive black hole at its core. That they're the mass of millions of suns, often up to billions of suns. Some of them are up to tens of billions of suns. And they're at the core of galaxies. And and some of them are generating tremendous amounts of energy and radiating it, because gas is is spiraling into the black hole. And as it spirals around the black hole, you get an accretion ring. You get a ring of gas spinning at closer and closer to light speed as it gets closer and closer to the, it maintains its angular momentum. Something that's spinning, around the thing, as it gets closer, it maintains its spin. It gets faster and faster, like on a roundabout. If you lean out and you lean in, it all speeds up.
Or the ice skater, the typical pirouette.
The ice skater,
yeah,
the Olympics, when they're spinning on ice with their arms out and then they tuck their arms in and they go much, much faster. They're maintaining their angular momentum. Well, now do that with gigantic clouds of gas around a black hole. It really spins and it heats up and radiates. So we have these, and quasars, the brightest things you can see in astronomy are essentially supermassive black holes pulling in huge amounts of gas closer and closer and radiating tremendous amounts of energy. So an evolutionary argument says that our universe is, let me just explain that. Let me explain a little bit more background before I do this. Currently, mainstream, I want to explain what the mainstream take on the early universe is before I expand on my one. The mainstream take is that galaxies form bottom up, that you essentially have this cloud of gas expanding, that it cools down, that eventually bits of it start to collapse under their gravitational pressure in slightly denser areas, and you get early stars, which they call population 3 stars, which is like the first stars are called population 3 stars, which is a beautiful example of how bad at language astronomy is. What do you call it? What do we call the first stars? We'll call them population 3 stars. Why? Because the reason is because they went ass backwards into this theory. Like, the population 1 stars are the recent ones we can see, and then we look back and we say, oh, there must be a population 2, and then you go back. Anyway, but population 3 stars are hard to make because the early universe doesn't have any carbon, doesn't have any oxygen, because they're made in stars, and you need carbon and oxygen and to basically cool the gas, to soak up the photons, to allow gas to cool enough to condense and then collapse into stars. So they've got a real problem already with creating stars in the early universe. They haven't been able to see this billion years, but they're guessing what happens in this billion years, right? Before the James Webb, there's this kind of cutoff. And they're guessing that what's happening is big, ugly, inefficient stars collapse and eventually start to fuse, but it's hard to fuse because they don't have carbon, they don't have oxygen, and so they can't do the triple alpha processes. It's very hard for early primitive stars that they are imagining exist to fuse, but they do. And then if some of the stars sort of pull each other together through gravity, and then they get clump a bit more, and then you get tiny galaxies of clumpy stars, and then those clump together. And it's a slow bottom-up process. And eventually, somehow you get supermassive black holes in the middle, but we're not sure how that happens, but maybe it happens through lots of little black holes colliding. But it's very hard to collide black holes in sufficient numbers fast enough to create supermassive black holes that are millions or billions of solar masses. And as they've been observing backwards and backwards before the James Webb, using the Hubble Space Telescope, they've been running out of time for a bottom-up process to generate big modern galaxies. They've just been running out of time for it to happen that way. So that's the mainstream model, okay? Star by star, it slowly builds up into eventually galaxies. And I had to think it through from an evolutionary point of view. What's more likely? What are we more likely to see? And if this theory is true, if the black holes give birth to big bangs, and if black holes are essentially the mechanism of reproduction, they're primary. Black holes are primary. Stars and galaxies are secondary. Human beings and sheep are tertiary, right? The one thing that universes are good at is making black holes, because if they weren't, they didn't reproduce, and they haven't got ancestors, they haven't got descendants. So and early primitive universes, before they were producing complexity, before they were producing galaxies, before they were producing 96 elements, before they were doing all the modern stuff that our galaxy does, were producing really big fucking black holes. They were producing supermassive black holes. They weren't producing trillions of small ones. They were producing a handful of big ones. That's just the logic of an evolutionary past for universes. So you're going in the evolutionary line that leads to us. You've got universes optimized for supermassive black hole production. So my argument is, and something that we have a real problem with in the mainstream theory right now is the early gas as it expands from the Big Bang is so smooth, it's incredibly hard to get stars out of it. It's not optimized for star formation at all. But my guess when I was making my predictions was that makes it optimized for supermassive black hole formation. That you can, because you can get a, if you can get a collapse, you can get a collapse of a big enough field of gas that that's smooth enough that it won't nucleate into stars as it collapses down, right? It will just continue and you'll get a direct collapse supermassive black hole. Now, there's really good mathematics on this from a bunch of researchers. Avi Loeb's done it. There's a whole bunch of good, solid, very mainstream scientists who have actually just worked out that there is a very clear mathematical path where you could get direct collapse supermassive black holes, where huge amounts of gas collapse, and it's so smooth that it doesn't break up into smaller clumps and turn into stars. It goes straight through into one gigantic black hole. And I'm arguing that that is exactly what you should get if you have an evolved universe, and that the direct collapse supermassive black hole generates the galaxy. You get the galactic core before you get the galaxy. And that will lead to really rapid, really early galaxy formation. Because one of the things that happens when you get a supermassive black hole is it's really gravitationally going to pull in a lot of gas. It's going to create an accretion disk. You're going to get, and that accretion disk of really hot gas which then jets out, relativistic jets, incredibly high powered, close to the speed of light jets. We know this happens in quasars. You're putting shock waves through the remaining gas. I'm arguing spraying out. You're creating in that accretion disk and those jets. I think what you're going to see is small amounts of fusion, enough fusion of carbon and oxygen to seed the conditions for star formation surrounding the supermassive black hole. That's what you should see if in an evolved universe, I think. And we have some evidence that you can get fusion in the accretion disk of supermassive black holes from the more recent universe. I'm arguing it's going to be much easier to do in the early universe. And as a result, you're going to see fully formed growing galaxies with supermassive black holes 50, 100 million years in. You're going to see them really, really, really early.
As a developmental biologist, I'm fascinated by the role of these holes as organizing centers, like you have in development tissue structures that actually shape what's happening around them, and that's how you get organized pattern formation. So there's another analogy.
Great.
That's really interesting. Yeah,
we can talk about this after the recording because I'd love to go deeper into that. Yes, yeah, it's very analogous to a biological, process, I think, in many ways. So I predicted very early rapid galaxy formation, and a few other things too. And what we've seen, the James Webb has now taken some images from the very early universe, and we're finding really early, really rapid, massive galaxy formation. We're finding exactly what I said, and we're finding supermassive. And
just to clarify.
Really
Nobody, so this was a surprise to the physicists, if I understand it correctly. I've only read the popular science articles about it, but that's true,
surprise.
Right?
Yeah, huge surprise. Every single piece that's been published on this, they talk to a whole bunch of other astronomers about the papers and what do you think of this? And everybody in every interview, this drives me crazy, says nobody predicted this.
no proper scientist, you know.
Nobody predicted this. And I totally understand, because they're not going to read my Substack, you know, but it's not true, you know, it's not true. There's a theory that's been sitting around in plain sight that nobody's played with. Now, one of the problems is I love Lee Smolin, but he's not a biologist, and he hasn't seen the implications of his own theory. So he's not a great, and also he's busy with other things. He went back to quantum gravity, and you know, that's what he studies. He's not out there trying to convince people of this theory. He's not even sure his own theory is true. He doesn't see the implications of his own theory. So there's nobody been I haven't been able to find anybody who's been taking that theory seriously, working out the implications of it, trying to make predictions on it. I haven't seen anyone doing it. But the predictions so far are turning out to be really accurate. And I was really shitting myself when I put those theories up, because I thought, you know, maybe I'm just completely wrong. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's something I'm missing here, that there's a real reason why this can't possibly be. And I've thrown away years of working on this and thinking about this, if I'm wrong in public on this.
But your career is not at stake. It's maybe that one of the reasons why people don't like to stick their head out anymore, because it's a risky business, and people are not into risky business in current science at the moment. Yeah, and you don't have anything to lose. I mean, you're maybe,
except my pride would be hurt. Like I put a lot of time into that.
I feel for you, but you know, it's not as bad as being ostracized by your community. You're already completely outside that.
Yeah,
so that's maybe what
you
were saying when you said it sometimes needs this reframing from outside.
Yeah.
But then, so the next question is, okay, so I have two questions here. One is, how do you get the scientists to take this serious? And the second question is, so how does that connect to being an artist? Does it at all, or are you now a rogue scientist in this? How do you see yourself there?
I don't know which one should I answer first? How do you get them to take it seriously is a question that is yet to be answered. I don't know. I think it will take a long time. I don't think, in a way, I think I need to outflank them. I need to build an audience for this among disaffected scientists rather than, you know, mainstream scientists, and probably I'm not sure. I want to get the ideas out into the conversation to such an extent that they have to engage with it. They have to engage with it, because they're not engaging with it, and it's understandable that they're not. But
do you see a role of the blog, and then of course the book? I mean, the book, people ask what is the point of a book nowadays, but it's still I ask what is the point of a book.
Yeah,
because, you know, we can ask that, but in the end, if you have a book and you can publish it, it's a popular science book, people read it, that'll increase the pressure, because people will just keep on asking.
Yeah, well, also in a way, the book is an excuse to do all the podcasts, do the interviews. The book is almost the excuse to spread the message through other channels that are more effective. You know, a $28 hardback book is a terrible mechanism for distributing ideas. It's a disastrous mechanism. It doesn't work. But you can use it to nucleate a conversation that does disseminate the idea. You know, if you talk about this for 2 hours on Joe Rogan with a stoned Joe Rogan, you will reach tens of millions of people, and you'll have 2 hours to talk about it. You know, if you publish a hardback with the best will in the world, no one's going to read to the end of it. So, but if you do the book, you can do Joe Rogan. So, you know.
Yeah. We're aspiring to more subscribers, but not quite Joe Rogan levels, I guess.
Well, spreading the idea, I don't know. New technologies create new art forms. So I'll go back to your question about being an artist or whatever. I kind of don't necessarily think of myself as an artist. I tend to call myself a writer. Mostly what I've written is fiction, but that's kind of weird fiction as well. A lot of my fiction is pretty weird. So a writer. And I think secretly underneath it, I think of myself to an extent as a philosopher. But, you know, a garage philosopher, you know. I mean, you know, I did do a degree in English literature and philosophy, and I like philosophy. I found philosophy kind of interesting, and it is a kind of a framework I use.
You have more credentials than I have, then, and it's not a protected title.
No, it's not. No. But what I think is new technologies create new art forms, and I'm finding Substack to be a new technology that I think is creating new art forms. A lot of the most interesting science writing I'm seeing is happening on Substack. You know, Adam Mastriani he published a paper on his Substack that caused a really big, good conversation. And he did that as an experiment. He was like, what happens if you don't publish a paper through the peer review process in a journal, but if you just put it on Substack? And it was a good paper. You know, it's a really interesting psychology paper.
That's an interesting. So there, even in neuroscience, I have a colleague called Eric Howell who's just moved pretty much to Substack because he's sick of,
I read him. He's great. His stuff's really
reviewed.
Interesting, and it gets a lot of readers. You know, there's Matt Clancy has a Substack where he writes New Things Under the Sun, which is he's essentially doing work, science of science. He's doing work on innovation in science and what's happened to innovation in science, what drives innovation, what suppresses innovation, where are we at as regards innovation in science, how can we make it better? That's a really interesting Substack. And what I'm trying to do there is create something that isn't a book and isn't a blog but is kind of what would you say? Is the nucleus for a conversation about something really important, a new art form. I don't really have a word for it.
So here's this is an interesting. I'm really interested in this because we said in the beginning that the role that you have here is not primarily, although you've been doing a lot of this to create new results. In fact, you've been engaged in this business as well now, but it's to integrate, provide different perspectives. And so the quality mechanism of traditional scientific publishing is peer review. It's massively under pressure. I think now with AI-assisted paper writing, it will completely collapse very soon. But it has worked, at least for part of the history. And I think one worry that I would bring up here is that the Substack ecosystem that's emerging, of course, has no quality controls. And you share it with the conspiracy theorists and also the Weinstein brothers of the world and so on and so forth. So how do you distinguish yourself from that? And then to play devil's advocates once again, just to, also, again, harking back to that discussion about AI, where the AI experts say, you have nothing to say because you're not an expert. So aren't the physicists coming out saying, you are based on first principles, you're disqualified to talk about this because you haven't studied physics for 20 years in your life. So do you encounter that problem? And what do you think about these problems? So first, the quality control aspect, and then the sort of, it goes hand in hand with being taken serious. So we have a ecosystem, information ecosystem pollution at really high levels that's going to be boosted by the flood of AI that we're getting. How do we do this? How do we get those? I listen to you, and you're really serious about this. And how do you distinguish yourself from others that have done 2 hours of Facebook research and then have their theory?
Yeah. Well, it is a huge problem. I mean, here's the thing: most people that come in from outside any given scientific realm and have a big theory are wrong. Most of them are catastrophically wrong, and some of them are lunatics. There's a lot of very obsessive people who have an obsessive theory about quantum blah blah, and they will go on about it. And so mainstream scientists are correct to have a heuristic that says some guy has come in from outside the field, he thinks he has a big theory, he's almost certainly wrong, and he's quite possibly a lunatic. That's a good heuristic. I don't have a problem with that. So what I have to do is, prove what you try and, in a way, what you try and do is win people over just one at a time, and it takes a long time. It takes a long time because you have to get through their defenses, and you have to, it's hard to change someone's worldview, But
so it's a form of community building that you have to do, basically. Otherwise, there's no way.
It's community building. Also, I could be wrong, and I could be a lunatic. So I need to be open to the feedback I get from the scientific community. You know,
I was gonna ask, aren't you obsessed about this?
I am obsessed with it, you know, and that's dangerous because obsession tends to correlate with it tends to correlate quite highly with let's say, you know, motivated reasoning and kind of like looking for evidence for your theory and not wanting evidence against, and so on and so on. You know, there's a lot of
cherry picking. Cherry picking.
Yeah, a lot of cherry. Yeah. It's a tendency to cherry picking, and I get that, and I am aware that I do cherry pick, you know. But then once I've picked a cherry, I really do need. What I often do is I show the cherry to someone else who knows more about it than me and says, "Is this a good cherry that I picked?" You know. So I'm behind the scenes. I'm talking to other scientists. I've run drafts past you of stuff. You know, like, am I wrong here?
I can publicly confirm that.
Yeah, and I've run drafts past other scientists, and I've got some very skeptical friends. I've got a friend who's an actual rocket scientist who's designed rockets that have flown, and he is a very, very low bullshit guy. You know, he really is skeptical of woo-woo. So I run ideas past him, and he is now on board. Like, he's like, holy shit, there's something here, and he's steering me towards, you know, stuff that he thinks is helpful, because he's trying to help. He thinks we have to work out what's the mechanism of transmission of information. I'm not that worried about it, because, you know, in the same way that when Darwin came up with his evolutionary theory, he had no idea about DNA, he had no idea about chromosomes, he had no idea about the mechanisms of transmission, but he still came up with a pretty good theory. You can go quite far without understanding the detail of the mechanism.
But it was only widely accepted, his theory, when the mechanism of transmission was actually connected. Yeah. It was discovered at the same time that he was publishing, and he didn't know about it. But
it had been discovered about 30. I mean, Mendel's stuff was around 30 years. It was published for decades before anyone picked up on it.
Right.
He's another example of really massive breakthroughs that can't gain traction until decades later, because other things need to happen to catch up, you know.
But what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that if we don't allow ourselves this little, again, playfulness and this little room, and there's increasing pressure not to do that. You have to also, I think, just coinciding with this increased pressure to publish, there's an increased pressure of publishing theories that are 100% solidly established in the beginning. And that's crazy, because if you look at the evolution of scientific knowledge itself, no new ideas has ever been well established when it was introduced. That's the job of people afterwards to go and look at it. Yeah. So
I'm not that worried about making some mistakes, as long as my main, as long as my big picture stuff survives the process, I'm totally happy to be humiliated on all the details.
So Conrad Howe-Waddington had this interesting idea. He was very engaged in arts, and actually published 2 books about arts. And he said so C.H. Waddington, he was famous for this Waddington's landscape in biology, and he said it's doing arts, for him engaging with arts was to flexing his mental joints, which was a really important exercise that he couldn't do in this cage that you were describing before, of the format of and that was in the 1950s and 60s when he published these things. So that's a problem that's been around for a while, but it's gotten increasingly worse, I think. And you're trying to sort of flex not just your own mental joints, but everyone's mental joints, I think, if I can say that. That's a really nice, worthwhile exercise.
I think it would change. It would change our model of the universe. It would change the way we think about our relationship to the universe. I think it would actually be psychologically really good for humanity to reconceptualize the universe and our relationship to it, because we've got a very unhealthy model right now that we're living in a meaningless universe of arbitrary characteristics that and we occurred completely accidentally, and we're just gonna, you know, the second law is just going to obliterate everything. Second law of thermodynamics is just going to obliterate everything. We're just heading towards heat death, and there's no meaning to any of it. But an evolved universe is kind of going somewhere, and we're part of it, and we're actually an important part of it. We're something that gets generated at a phase transition. You know, we're at the phase transition between DNA evolution, cultural evolution, and technological evolution. You know, which the universe is clearly evolved to do. You know, there's a logic to, there's a logic to evolution. You know, once you've got self-replicating organisms that, actually, I'll play this out. Once you've got self-replicating organisms that can detect each other, and that then they will want to eat each other because they're made out of the stuff that they're made out of. Each is made out of the stuff that the other's made out of. You're going to get predator-prey relationships. Once you've got predator-prey relationships, you have a ratchet upward into cognition. You have a ratchet upward into intelligence, because as predators and prey prey on each other, the predator, the prey has to get cleverer to escape the predator. The predator has to get cleverer to capture the newly more intelligent prey. The dumber predators and the dumber prey aren't as successful as the smarter ones, and you get this cognitive ratchet up into us. So that's going to happen, and once you've ratcheted up to something like us, we are able to manipulate matter. So now we're the matter that manipulates matter inside the organism, which means we're a new organelle inside the cell of the universe. That had to happen given the evolved parameters of matter, and given it's evolution all the way down, and cognitively complex entities that can manipulate matter will try to optimize for energy. They need energy to survive. They will try to optimize their energy sources, and you can see us chasing energy efficiency up the scale from, setting fire to a forest to toast your marshmallow, to oil and gas, to nuclear, to renewables, solar, and so on. And what's interesting, and this is a bit where this has been mentioned to Lee Smolin, and he doesn't like it. He thinks it's science fictional. But I think he's wrong. He's just wrong. There's an absolute logic to this. If you've got matter manipulating matter that wants to survive and thrive, as life forms have to do to have evolved at all. You don't evolve life forms that don't care whether they live or die. So once you've got those, they're going to try and optimize for energy efficiency. And the most efficient energy source in the universe is a black hole. The gravitational matter that goes down the gravitational spiral into a black hole, you can get over 30% of the mass converted to energy, which is why quasars blast out tens of thousands of times more light than a standard galaxy of stars. They're incredibly, you can produce tremendous amounts of energy through black holes. They're nearly so much more energy efficient than fusion. Fusion, you get 0.6% of the mass can get turned into energy, 30 to 40% from black holes. So the ultimate line of matter manipulating matter like us leads towards the most efficient use of energy in the universe, which is small black holes. And a guy called Crane, is it Louis Crane, has written a paper on this where he's worked out what are the optimum sizes for black holes for energy production, and they're pretty small. You get about an Everest size piece of matter, and if you can compress it down to a black hole, you can generate phenomenal amounts of energy from it. So there's actually a reason why this complexity evolves in evolutionary terms. You end up with 3 levels of black hole production, each of which is evolutionarily earlier than the previous one. Supermassive black holes are primal. The universe has however primitive a universe gets, it must always be able to create at least one supermassive black hole to reproduce. And once it was able to produce 2, once it was a split and it was producing some little set of parameters, accidentally managed to produce 2 rather than 1, off you go, evolution happens. And the offspring of those are producing more and more supermassive black holes. But at some point, supermassive black holes fail to take all the primal stuff into themselves, and there's a bit left over, and you end up with stars. And stars, in some early primitive evolutionary history of universes, can collapse to produce smaller black holes, stellar mass black holes. So this universe contains a very large number of supermassive black holes, but not incalculably, but many orders of magnitude more stellar mass black holes. But if life such as us, if matter manipulating matter such as us is common in this universe, the likelihood is that we will end up producing many orders of magnitude more, even smaller black holes that couldn't be produced just by stars and galaxies, and that couldn't be produced just by big bangs.
I do agree with Lee that this is science fiction in the sense that it's not going to solve our current energy crisis, but it's an interesting speculative thought.
But it gives you a mechanism. It gives you a reason why intelligent life is evolved. It gives you an evolutionary justification for this level of complexity.
So basically, life in this speculative thought would be.
That's very speculative, and that's where I will lose some people because it's highly speculative. It's unproven.
Oh, but you're a science fiction author after all, so this is an interesting idea. Are you writing a novel about this?
No, I put some of these ideas, some of them into my last novel, and they were buried too deep. People didn't find them because they're reading a science fiction novel and they go, "That's an interesting idea." But so I've actually I don't want to do this in a novel. It's just it buries the ideas too deep, and also they get camouflaged against the background of all the other science fiction novels. It's a bad space into which to put properly grounded, thought through scientific ideas that are actually based on a plausible dynamic, because there's too many other science fiction books that have implausible but superficially impressive theories and so on. I don't want to.
So I want to pick up on two things that you said. So in this theory, I mean, now going back to before the human produced or the life produced black holes, but so two aspects that I find very attractive are, first of all, that we are, even without that extra production of small black holes, we are part of a meaningful narrative in a sense that.
That's an optional add-on. I'm totally fine with people not accepting that. Just go with me as far as you can go with me. I'm just saying.
But I don't think you need that to have this vision of a meaningful universe that we're part of, that we're playing an important part in. And the other thing that I really like, and that's been striking me again in recent discussions about the future of humanity in the context of AI, is this insane idea that we have to be around forever. So this is a really processual view of the world, and we play the part for the time being, and then there will be something else in the future, and hopefully it'll be something nicer. But the idea that we have to sort of eternalize ourselves, transcend this, through a singularity of a technological kind, is just completely crazy. And I think this sort of process-based worldview is completely is much less conducive to such crazy ideas than the idea that the universe is a meaningless machine that is up there for us to be manipulated. So we have to create our own meaning in there, or it's completely existentialist. It's no coincidence that Monod was writing Chance and Necessity in a environment in which the existentialists just proclaimed life meaningless because of death. And that's exactly the wrong way around, because as you said before, if you are not a fragile being that is suffering and dying at some point, there is no meaning in life at all. And I think this is a vision of the universe that accommodates this sort of ethic much better than what we have right now, and is the vision of modernity, is that the world is a machine, and we are here, our purpose is to manipulate it for our own purposes. So there you can go back and say, okay, so this is almost a secular spiritual dimension of the whole thing. I don't like the word spiritual at all. It's very dangerous to utter it, but it's in the sense of giving us a greater meaning, maybe in the sense of the ancients, that the ancient Greeks lived in a world that had a logos and was permeated by this. It wasn't just an abstract sort of logos that was somewhere else. It was
exactly. So, this goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning. The religious and spiritual language has explored some of this territory, and now we can't use the words because they've been defined as inherently unscientific. But you can use some of these terms without having God, without having a whole other layer of reality that we can't access, that is, you know.
I think it's worth stressing for listeners that two things. First, you said it before, that we're not saying we should get rid of science. We want more and better science. And the other thing is that we're not advocating for some sort of spiritual woo, but that we're trying to have a naturalistic explanation of why weird phenomena that we can't explain yet by naturalistic explanations exist. So we want to have more naturalistic explanation and not like, just, you know, saying, as you said before, just declaring something a non-problem, saying it's not a problem, it's just a coincidence, is not a scientific explanation, basically.
It's like it's an improv approach. It's yes and, you know, yes to reductionist materialist science. Yes. You're doing an astonishing job, and we need to do some other things as well to get the best out of what you've done so far. It's like one of the things I really love about this evolved universe idea is that you don't have to throw away anything. You keep everything. You keep the cosmic microwave background radiation. You keep the Big Bang. You keep redshifts. You keep everything we've observed about galaxies. You don't have to change or throw away anything to make this work. Do you know what I mean? It's beautifully conservative. It's a profoundly conservative theory. It's just saying universes and evolution. And we already have a universe and we already have evolution. There's literally nothing added.
Well, you know, it's not just, you know, the sum is greater than its parts here. There's a synergy. So
more is different.
You gain a lot more than just by adding the ideas up. So Julian, we want to be mindful of your time. But I had a few questions. If everybody's okay with that, if we can go on a little bit more. Please. About your journey. So you talked about the journey of the universe and how it got where it is. So I want to know a little bit more about your journey towards this. And one thing I want to start with is been happening on your blog as well. You got interrupted in writing your book through a story about a poem that you wrote that's quite famous. And I want to connect to that and want you to say a few things about that poem. First of all, because it's a funny and interesting story. But second, also that poem reflects, interestingly, a lot of the ideas that we were talking about right now. So can you tell us a little bit about the story of the poem and what you wanted to express with it, maybe, and how it connects to your current endeavors?
Okay. So about 11 years ago, I wrote a poem. I mean, I don't even think of it as a poem. There's some internal rhymes there, but it ended up getting called a poem. And since the weird thing about the poem was it was the ending to the computer game Minecraft. I was asked to write, and I wrote a piece of text, a narrative, a conversation between two people that ended up getting called the end poem. So I'm in the unusual position of having written a poem that has sold 266 million copies, which is unusual for a poem. So that was a strange experience.
But you have to play the game in survival mode. You have to slay the Ender Dragon, and then when you slay the Ender Dragon, then you get the poem. And tell us a little bit more about the format and the content of the poem, because I love it.
Well, okay. So Minecraft's an interesting game. It's an unusual game. It's it's the biggest selling game of all time, and it overtook Tetris a couple of years ago, and Grand Theft Auto 5. So it's I think they're the only 3 games that have sold more than 100 million. But it was basically created by one guy. It was created by Marcus Persson. His nickname's Notch, Swedish developer. And so it's a very one guy game. And he was about to launch it. He sold it in beta. He was like, you could buy the beta for like, I think $15, and he'd give you the finished game when it was done. Otherwise, it was going to cost you $20. But he ended up selling like 5 million copies in beta, and he was about to launch the game in Las Vegas, and he didn't have an ending because it was still in beta, and he felt he needed a narrative. He needed something. He wanted a story. He wanted, when you kill the Ender Dragon in survival mode, you've gone through this experience, and he felt something should happen. It should be words, but he's not a word guy. So he asked on Twitter, does anyone know any writers? You know, any good writers, preferably famous, but you know, whatever, who'd be suitable to write the ending to Minecraft. And somebody who knew my work and knew him recommended me to him. So I ended up writing the ending. And that was a funny experience. How do you, Yogi, what do you want me to say about it? Because there's a lot of different things I could say here.
So for me, I just watched it again. So there's a YouTube version of it. You don't have to slay the Ender Dragon to read the poem. You can go on YouTube and see it there, actually.
Anyway, go.
It's this text that scrolls, and these two characters, part of the text is not legible because it contains concepts that our brains are not capable of processing. And the two characters are in the world of the game, and they talk, well, are they, or they are, you know, in the world that the game is in, maybe better expressed, and they are wondering about reality. And so I think this is increasingly important today, virtual versus real reality. So they're giving you a bit of a confusing experience about what is the real world. And
and they're talking about they're talking about the player.
What you are the player, and what do you understand, and what can we understand about the world? It's for a video game end poem, it's extremely philosophical, Julian. So what on earth did you want to express with that poem? You don't have to explicate yourself here, but I'm more interested in how did this, I mean, it seems to me, I just read that poem and it seems to me that it fits completely in your journey towards this theory that it gives you a more meaningful view of the world, and is pondering really about what do we actually understand about that world, and what is reality in the first place, and why is it the way it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I think earlier, recently I was thinking about what do I do? What am I? What am I interested in? And as I said, the thing I came up with was, I think I want to see reality more clearly. I'm very, for personal reasons, due to my life, my childhood, my various, adventures, I really want to see the universe more clearly. I want to see reality more clearly. And I'm aware that often large groups of people do not see reality clearly and have a consensual version of reality that's wrong. I grew up in extremely Catholic Ireland, in the a long time ago, and it was the whole society, it was wrong about some significant things, and it was not a healthy society to grow up in. So I'm quite aware that entire societies can be wrong about things, which I think is one of the reasons it's fairly easy for me to go, I think I'm right, and the entire scientific community is wrong about this thing. I've had practice because various, like my principal and the principal of my primary school and the vice principal of my primary school, they were both later jailed for sexual offenses against children. So I grew up in a society that was wild, that just had this superficial version of reality, and underneath it there was something completely different going on, and it was like, oh, this is I'm gonna have to think for myself, because this is very dangerous, So I've been trying to see reality more clearly since those days. And I think I've jumped off the question. Give me the question again.
Yeah, so no, I was just wondering. So then you wrote this poem about what reality really is, and you pitched it to this developer guy, or did he look at your previous work and he said, I want you to write this? How did this work? I got end up in the game?
I got an email from him saying someone had recommended me to him, and he'd like me to write the ending to it. And I said I didn't know if I was the right guy for him, because I'm a weird writer, I'm a strange writer. And so I said, look, I'll send you a short story I've written, and you tell me if I'm the right guy for you. So I sent him a story called The Eye Hole. The Eye Hole's a slightly satirical, slightly science fiction-y story I'd written around then. And he really liked that story, and he said, yeah, you're the right guy. So I wrote this ending, and I asked him what he wanted, and he said he didn't know. He said, you're the word guy. I just want to narrate. I want something at the end that satisfying at the end, but I don't know how long it should be. Doesn't matter. Just give me something. I trust you. So it was lovely. It was a lovely commission. It was, I'm very fond of Marcus. We have fallen out subsequently, as people do when things sell 266 million copies. but you know, I'm very fond of him. Yeah, I mean, he's done and said some weird things since then, which I don't always agree with, but as a guy, in my experience of knowing him, I liked him. So I thought about it, and I thought, this is, people are going from a virtual reality in which they're completely immersed into this reality, which they think they understand, but probably don't really, because we're locked inside our heuristics, we're locked inside language, we're locked inside our social conventions. We're not really seeing reality. And I wanted to give them, I thought, this is a very interesting transitional zone as they go from one world to the other, where I can really play, I think, with the psychological space that they're in. And what should I do there? And I thought about it, and I thought, what I want to do here is I want to give them everything that I've learned that I think is of any importance. I want to somehow deliver to them what I know about, or what I think is true about reality that might be of some use to them. So I started writing this thing between two people. It's that kind of dialogue that they would be sort of overhearing, and that was about them. They get talked about. Because I asked Marcus, can I get the player's name into the dialogue so that they see their own names spoken inside it? Because and he said, yeah, I can code for that. That's fine. And I said, can I have some parts of this text unreadable, encrypted in some way, so that you can see it but not really read it? And he said, yeah, I can do that. So I wrote this piece where they talk about the player, but they also talk about reality. And a strange thing happened halfway through, and this is where I don't want to set off anyone's radar here. I don't want to set off anyone's fire alarms. But I'm a writer, and many writers and artists will tell you they've had the same thing happen. This is very common. This is very normal. But I was halfway through writing a draft of the piece. I was writing longhand in a notebook. And the second half of that piece, and it didn't change a huge amount. Normally I write many drafts. The second half of this didn't change a huge amount. The pen started moving faster, and words were coming out, and the words got ahead of my mind. I wasn't thinking the words. I was writing words and then reading them afterwards and going, whoa, where'd that come from? You know? And that's how the ending to Minecraft was written. I didn't really write it. You know what I mean? I physically wrote it, but I didn't think up the words and write them down. Some layer of this piece of matter that manipulates matter generated the text, and I took it down. So in a weird way, I felt that the universe wrote the ending to Minecraft, you know, and it's about the universe, and it does contain a lot of the seeds for the ideas that I'm exploring in The Egg and the Rock, because I've been kind of focusing in for my whole life on seeing reality more clearly at, I hope deeper and deeper levels. And that ending has connected with a lot of people in very interesting ways. I get really extraordinary emails and messages about that ending. And I don't feel I can't entirely take responsibility for it. You know, it's like, I get messages from people saying that, you know, it got them through their divorce, or they were depressed, but they pulled out of it after, you know, beating the Ender Dragon and reading my ending, and really moving, really strange, powerful stories. Like a woman recently sent me a message saying that her son is autistic but loved Minecraft, and you know, about 10 years ago he was playing the game, and he finished the game, and she was in another room, and she heard something strange, and she went into the room to see, and he was crying, and she said he was autistic, and she'd never heard him cry before from anything that wasn't pain, but he just read the ending, and he wept. She said they still use that when they're talking about emotions and they're talking about feelings and that, when they're trying to explain, she's trying to explain them to him, or he's trying to explain something to her, they'll go back to the Minecraft ending as a sort of touchstone. So it really connects with people in a way that's very interesting. So
it's an interesting, it's almost like a multimodal experience of philosophical idea that you've achieved with not writing, but letting the universe write the poem through you there, I guess. Yeah.
but as soon as you say the universe wrote it through me, it sets off alarms in any reductionist materialist's head. He's a fucking lunatic, you know.
Oh.
But I'm just saying this is what happened. I wrote a piece. I didn't know what the words were going to be. I was surprised by them. They moved people. They seemed, and the thing was, I was ventriloquizing the universe. It is the universe talking to people in the piece. That was what I was kind of trying to do.
There's so many beautiful kind of parallels coming from, of course, the cultural and artistic perspective where we're deeply rooted. And I mean, as you talk about your end poem, I have Beckett's End Game flowing through my brain, and you know, I think about other writers who do this, but also who describe the creative process and how familiar it is for anybody who is producing to describe that feeling of in fact having something flow through you rather than come directly from you. Yeah. And I don't think it's woo-woo. I think that is how our ideas are collected, communally, collectively, particularly for those of us who exist in a sort of inter and transdisciplinary space. So I think it's incredible to sort of hear that and think about really what the creative process is as a model, because that risk-taking and that play that is so present in art making and it has been in many of the conversations we have with people practicing in the sciences has been obliterated, is in fact very dangerous. And does make it all the poorer. But at the same time, just to think about the parallels in the cultural world in terms of what you described as, you know, some of what's happening in the scientific world and specialization, this inaccessibility to language, the sort of siloing of art. And within art of various kinds of art is equally highly problematic. It's kind of every time we see something extraordinary or that surprises us in the art, it is exactly those moments when it's leapt across its sort of definition. And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's definitely for another time. But one of the first things that, as you speak, that comes to me is, you know, how for artists or for the people on the street is how is life constituted or defined within the sciences? You know, I think about 8 years of research and work we did in the middle of the Karoo Desert in Southern Africa, and how the communities and people we worked with there, the Griqua, the Nama, that those that are referred to as Bushmen would talk about life existing in rock and in sand and in material that we don't see as organism necessarily, and yet having a kind of a property that was one that was worth respect and one that had to be understood. And so I almost wonder, as we contemplate the mechanizing of the universe from a sort of analogical perspective, have we also forgotten to regard material that is perhaps not organism as that which is also full of enormous process and evolution and wonder? So those are some of the questions, you know. I don't like, I wanted to throw that out, like, what is the definition for science of life at this point? And is that not part of the sort of first problematizing? When did life get defined in English? Because of course other languages have very different and other cultures have very different time frames for how they constitute an organism or a thing that holds life.
Well, if you think about, I agree with very much with a great deal of what you're saying there, because I think if you think about this universe as essentially an organism of which we are a part, we're just a part of the organism. Everything else in it is also part of the organism, and it puts you in a different relationship to the rocks. It puts you in a different relationship to the lakes, you know. And you can't treat them as shabbily when you realize they're part of you and you're part of them, which is literally true. The water that comes out of that lake, if you crap arsenic into that lake, you're crapping it into your child, who's going to have to drink water that ultimately is going to come from that lake. And you seeing yourself as a part of an organism, we're all part of that circulation. There's the water is circulating, the air is circulating, it's coming through us and back out. It puts you in a different relationship, and communities such as those you were speaking of in the Karoo Desert, same happens in Australia. If you read their kind of philosophy of the universe, it's very good. And it ties in a lot with what I'm arguing, and it's a healthier way to relate to your environment. We're very isolated from it, very artificially, and it's partly because of reductionist materialist science placing us outside of the universe. Yeah.
This is
and that thing you said earlier as well, sorry, but that thing you said earlier as well, I thought was really good about science and its alienation from the experience of creating in the arts. I think you're completely correct. I think one of the things that science is really missing now, that it really needs, is a relationship to the muse. Artists can have a relationship to the muse. Now that there isn't a muse, there's no Greek girl in a dress that's going to come into your room if you're polite and help you, right? But there is a muse. That when we talk about the muse, something happens in human minds when they're creating that isn't coming from the conscious level, and you might as well call it the muse. I mean, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about this. She says, take the pressure off yourself as an artist and use the idea of the muse to take the pressure off yourself as an artist. You're not doing this with your conscious mind all the time. And scientists are trying to do it all with their conscious mind all the time, and it cuts them off from the muse. And another way of saying everything I've been saying is to say scientists are in a bad relationship to the muse, and as a result, they are not getting fundamental breakthroughs. Yeah,
fascinating. Sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this urge to manipulate the world instead of having a creative. So in your view, the world has, again, we don't have words for this, but you could say it has a mind on its own. And I'm really strongly against panpsychists, and I think they're silly, as I told you, Julian, before. But I don't. It's a metaphor again, right? So it is not manipulative. What I want to say, it's just not a manipulable machine. It's just the machine metaphor is also a metaphor, and it's a worse metaphor than the metaphor you're bringing to us, both for our own treating ourselves and the world we live in. I think that's a really nice way of putting it.
Yeah, we're kind of the taste buds of the universe. We're the universe tasting itself, which is you know what I mean? The universe develops, and at some point it develops taste buds, and now it's able to taste itself, and now it's able to move this way and that way and manipulate things better. That's where we're at, and that's a beautiful thing to be. It's a beautiful thing to be. And the trouble is, the only people that have kind of developed that idea are inside mystical traditions, spiritual traditions, and that language is completely toxic to getting anything published in a peer-reviewed journal in the sciences. But you read Hindu mythologies, you read Buddhist works, and you read Sufi stuff, whatever. There's a huge number of traditions that have thought about our relationship to the universe in similar terms to this. They didn't know about Darwin, they didn't know about evolution, they didn't know about DNA, but they did know that we are the taste buds of the universe. And they've done a lot of thinking about that.
We've been basing
there's stuff there that's really useful, and you can bring it into relation with the reductive materialist mountains of data that we have already, and they will transform each other. They will transform each other. It's not just that scientists who are reductionist materialists must learn from the mystical traditions. The mystical traditions can really find helpful information in the data stacks of reductionist materialism. Every time I read a guru, I wish the guru knew a little bit about neuroscience and a little bit about physics. And every time I read a physicist, I wish he knew a little bit about mysticism and spirituality and the Bhagavad Gita.
There's a cognitive psychologist called John Vervaeke that you may know of, that has this religion is not a religion. That's really like the concept you just described. It's a relationship, a narrative relationship with the world that is not in a dogmatic form, and it's really interesting. Unfortunately, he's becoming rather dogmatic and a bit cultish lately himself. It's very easy to fall into that.
Anyone who I think there's a problem with, if you see one thing more clearly than most people, you tend to obsess on it, and the more you obsess on it, you're going to go a little too far and become a lunatic. But the early to mid works of such people are always great.
Good, yeah. And then we've been reading Jonathan. Do you know Jonathan Rosen's Tasting the Pickle? So it just struck me the parallel of the taste buds of the universe, because he says we can only face the oncoming crisis. We have all the facts, but we need to taste the pickle we're in. And so it's a multimodal way. This reminded me of your poem again. This is a multimodal way of experiencing the situation. Your poem is not about a crisis, but it's about existence. And that's the same thing. We have to sort of try to experience the situation we're in a more embodied and situated manner, I think. Yeah.
And I think an evolved universe puts us in relation to so much more. We expand as an individual. When you really internalize the idea of the universe as an evolved organism and us as a part of it, you get you expand enormously, and it's really, I think, spiritually good for us, but also psychologically good for us. It's socially good for us.
I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I have so many more questions, but maybe we just have another chat in the future at some point.
Another one.
When your book comes out, when is the book going to come out?
Oh, I'm really slow. I don't know. In a way, the book is an excuse to write the Substack. In a way, the Substack is the important thing. The book gives me an end point, and it gives me some sort of structure and something to aim for. But I'm enjoying the Substack so much. I'm not that worried about when the book comes.
That's great. It's a process, and the most bizarre thing about publishing a book is to end the process at some point and then put it out there as a book. So that's
quite artificial.
Really arbitrary.
In a way, it's quite artificial.
Yeah. So I love that. So the Substack is called The Egg and the Rock. The author is Julian Gough. Thanks so much for spending your time with us, and we're looking forward to many more interesting conversation in the future. Thanks a lot.
I loved talking about it with you. It's really nice to dig into it for 2 hours, and I hope you found it interesting, and give me feedback. Anyone out there who thinks I'm wrong about something or has a useful piece of feedback, I want to hear it. I don't want to just talk about this in some kind of void. I'm doing it in public so I can get feedback, so I can improve the ideas and enrich them. And I've already found it tremendously fruitful to talk to scientists and non-scientists, philosophers and non-philosophers about this, so that they've already improved my thinking on this a lot. And
so go to Substack, The Egg and the Rock. That's where you find Julian. Thanks everyone for listening. I think one take-home message is, and that's also nice with the game poem at the end, one of the things that we're trying to achieve here is that we need to play with ideas more, and that's become increasingly difficult. So thanks for playing with ideas with us for 2 hours. And
you're welcome. Thanks, Yogi.
All right.
Pleasure. Thanks all of you.